3 days before my brother's engagement party, he sent me a text telling me I wasn't invited. Not a phone call, not even a voice message, so I could hear him stumble through the explanation. Just a text, at 7:14 in the morning, while I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the coffee shop I had been going to every day for 6 years, without anyone deciding I was a problem. Gwen, I'm sorry, but the Hartfords are pretty formal about these things. Mom and I talked. It's just easier if you sit this one out. You know how things get with you lately. I stared at the phone, long enough that my coffee went lukewarm. Long enough that the parking lot filled up around me, with people who had normal mornings and normal families, and no idea that somewhere across town my mother and my brother had sat down together and decided that I was the kind of thing that needed to be managed around. You know how things get with you lately. He meant the divorce. I had been divorced 11 months ago, and apparently that had permanently reclassified me as unstable in the family taxonomy. Not Gwen who showed up every Christmas. Not Gwen who drove 2 hours when Mom had her appendix out. Not any version of me that had actually existed for 31 years before I had the bad taste to leave a marriage that was quietly killing me. Just you lately, dropped into a text like a diagnosis. I typed out 4 different responses and deleted every one of them. What I knew about the Hartfords was everything my brother had told me in the 10 months since he'd met Priscilla at a conference in Boston. Old New England family. A house in Greenwich. A grandfather who had founded some kind of coastal shipping insurance company decades ago. My brother used the word legacy more times in those 10 months than I had heard anyone use it in my entire life before that. He'd started wearing different clothes. He held his fork differently at dinner. My mother had taken to referring to the Hartfords in a hushed, reverent tone, the way people talk about something they haven't fully processed but desperately want to be true. The Hartfords felt this way about seating arrangements. The Hartfords kept these particular traditions at parties. The Hartfords. And so I was out. I didn't go home and cry about it. I want to be honest about that. I went into the coffee shop, ordered my usual, sat at the corner table, and felt something colder and quieter than sadness. The kind of feeling that isn't grief yet because you haven't fully registered what was taken from you. I thought about calling him. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about texting back something measured and adult that would make me feel dignified and accomplish absolutely nothing. Instead, I went to work. I told myself that families do this to each other sometimes, and that it would pass, and that Priscilla seemed like a genuinely decent person from the 3 times I'd met her, even if her father gave me a slightly unsettled feeling I had never been able to explain. That feeling came back 3 days later when my brother sent me the video. He sent it at 11:15 on a Saturday night. The engagement party had apparently gone beautifully. The Hartford estate in Greenwich looked like something out of an architectural spread, all wrought iron and old oak, and a terrace strung with lights above a manicured lawn that probably had its own full-time caretaker. The video was 42 seconds long. My brother had clearly recorded it from across a crowded room, a little shaky, the ambient noise of 200 people eating, past hors d'oeuvres, beneath the sound of a man speaking into a microphone near the fireplace. The man was Warner Hartford, Priscilla's father, the patriarch. The man my mother had described to me as distinguished, silver-haired. The kind of person who makes a room quieter just by walking into it. He was giving a toast. I watched it twice before I heard it. He said something about his daughter's happiness, something about watching her grow into a woman of character, something about welcoming my brother into the family as though he had always belonged there. Standard toast material. Nothing remarkable on the surface. And then, wrapping up, his voice lifting into the particular cadence of a man who knows exactly how to close a room, he said. And that's the beauty of it. I hit pause. I sat on my couch in my apartment and I did not move for 20 full seconds. My hands were cold. My chest had done something unusual, a kind of contraction I can only describe as the body's version of a full stop, every system briefly suspending while the brain catches up to something it has already recognized faster than conscious thought can process. And that's the beauty of it. I pressed play again. I listened to the last 8 seconds 3 more times. The voice, the phrasing, the precise rhythm of those 6 words at the end of what I understood now, listening to it again, had always been a pitch. Was not something I had heard once or twice in passing. I had heard it on 43 phone calls over the course of 4 months. I knew it the way you know a song that got lodged in your head against your will. The way you know a smell you can't name, but that takes you somewhere specific the instant it hits you. The man at that microphone was not Warner Hartford. His name was Craig Lester, and 18 months ago, Craig Lester had taken $47,000 from me. I need to back up. After my divorce was finalized, I made some decisions I would not describe as my finest. Not catastrophic decisions, not the kind that end up on a cautionary list. Just the quiet, exhausted decisions of a person who is suddenly alone after 7 years and doesn't quite trust her own instincts yet. One of them was responding to an email from a financial advisory service I had seen promoted through a professional network. The email was warm and specific, and referenced a colleague of mine by name, which I now understand is called social engineering, and which at the time I understood as a reason to trust it. Craig Lester presented himself as a licensed investment advisor, specializing in real estate-backed portfolios. He had a professional website, he had a LinkedIn with 700 connections and 3 glowing recommendations. He had a clear, measured voice and the habit of ending every conversation with, and that's the beauty of it. As though whatever he had just laid out was so elegantly designed it could speak for itself. I found it reassuring. I found him reassuring. Over 4 months, I moved $47,000, most of what I had received from the divorce settlement, the money I had been planning to use as a down payment on something stable and mine, into what he described as a diversified coastal real estate fund with a conservative 3-year horizon. By the time I understood what had happened, Craig Lester didn't exist anywhere I could find him. The website was gone, the LinkedIn was gone, the phone number went to a disconnected recording. The fund, obviously, had never existed. I filed a report with the FBI's white-collar crime division. I spoke to an agent twice. They told me these cases were difficult, that the suspect had likely moved across state lines, that they would be in touch. They were not in touch. 11 months passed, and I slowly rebuilt what I could and tried not to look directly at the number $47,000, because looking at it directly made me feel like the floor was shifting under my feet. I still had the agent's card in my wallet. I had moved apartments twice, and that card had come with me both times, slipping from one wallet pocket to another, without me ever making a conscious decision to keep it. I told myself I was holding on to it as documentation. I think I was holding on to it because I wasn't ready to accept that it was over. I pulled it out now. Agent Rachel Flores, FBI White Collar Crime Division, Boston Field Office. I had her number memorized by the 4th time I'd dialed it 18 months ago. It came back without any effort. I called her at 11:47 on a Saturday night. She answered on the 3rd ring. I didn't apologize for the hour. I told her I had something she needed to hear. I told her Craig Lester had surfaced, that I had a video, 42 seconds of footage from a private engagement party in Greenwich, Connecticut, and that the man giving the toast was using the name Warner Hartford. I described the phrase. I told her I had kept recordings of 43 calls with Craig Lester, because the FBI had told me documentation was important, and I had been a very thorough student of my own catastrophe. There was a silence on the other end, not disbelief. Something different from that, the silence of someone pulling up a file. Mrs. Harrington, she said, I need you to email me that video in the next 10 minutes. Then I need you not to contact anyone in that family until I call you back. I emailed her the video in 4. She called me back 6 hours later, at 6 in the morning, and when she spoke, her voice had a quality I hadn't heard the other 2 times we'd talked. Not exactly excitement. Something more controlled. The careful flatness of a person delivering information they have been containing very deliberately. Craig Lester's real name, she told me, was not Craig Lester either. That had been one of at least 4 confirmed identities since 2019. The man in that video had been operating across 3 New England states under various aliases, most recently as Warner Hartford, a persona he had constructed with extraordinary patience over 3 years, complete with fabricated genealogy records, a forged deed to the Greenwich property, and a manufactured family history anchored to a shipping insurance company that had never filed a single document with the state of Connecticut. He was wanted in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. There were 11 confirmed victims. I was one of them. He had spent 3 years building the Hartford identity, not for a single payout, but for a marriage. My brother's upcoming marriage to Priscilla would have given Craig Lester access to my brother's accounts, my mother's savings, and the kind of established social credibility that would make the next identity easier still to construct and inhabit. Agent Flores told me not to warn anyone in the family. She said there was a federal coordination already in progress, and that if the suspect suspected anything, he would disappear again, and they would lose him a second time. I asked her how long. She said, 3 days. The rehearsal dinner was in 2. I want to be precise about what those 48 hours felt like. I went to work both days. I answered emails. I ate meals I couldn't taste and slept in intervals that didn't add up to rest. I didn't call my brother. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call anyone, because Agent Flores had been very clear and because I understood, in a way I hadn't understood during any of the previous 11 months, that what I did or didn't do in this window actually mattered. I was not the person who could be uninvited this time. I was the only person, even without being in the room, who knew what was actually in it. I thought about Priscilla. More than my brother, more than my mother, I thought about her, whether she had known. Whether she had been shaped by the same long, careful process I had been, months of calibrated warmth, the right words at the right moments, the impression of being seen by someone who understood exactly what you needed to hear. Whether the father she had grown up with was someone she loved, or whether she had been living, for years without knowing it, inside the same kind of constructed fiction I had mistaken for a legitimate investment account. I found out later that Priscilla had been told her entire life that her mother had died when she was 4 years old, and that her father had raised her alone because his work required frequent relocation. She had never known extended family. She had no photographs of her mother. She had grown up inside a story with no seams visible from the inside, and she had been 26 before she began noticing the places where things didn't quite fit together. She had been approximately 6 months from figuring it out herself. The arrest happened during the rehearsal dinner. I wasn't there. I know the details because my brother called me the same night, his voice doing something I had never heard it do before. Shaking continuously, the way something structural shakes when the thing holding it in place gives way. He said there had been federal agents. He said they had come in during the salad course. He said Warner Hartford had stood up from the table, and for one moment looked directly at my mother before the agents reached him. And it was that look. Not the badges, not the handcuffs, but that specific look that had made our mother understand, faster than any explanation could have delivered it, that something she had built a significant portion of her recent hope on had never existed. My brother talked for close to 40 minutes. I let him. When he finally stopped, I asked whether Priscilla was okay. He said he didn't know yet. I said that was probably the most important thing to find out. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did you know? How did you even?" He trailed off, unable to finish the architecture of the question. I told him about Craig Lester. I told him about the $47,000. I told him about the phrase at the end of the toast and the 43 calls I had kept on my hard drive, because documentation matters, and I had been a very good student of my own disaster. I told him about the card I had carried through 2 apartment moves without understanding why I couldn't throw it away. My brother was silent for a long time. "Gwen," he said. "Yeah." He stopped, started again. "I don't know how to." I told him he didn't have to figure it out tonight. I told him to go find Priscilla if he could. I said we could talk more when he was ready, and then I let him go, and I sat in my apartment in the dark, and I thought about the text from 3 days ago. It's just easier if you sit this one out. You know how things get with you lately. I thought about $47,000. I thought about the way my mother's voice sounded when she talked about the Hartfords. That hushed reverence, that slightly trembling quality of someone who has decided, finally, that things are going to be better now. That the right door has opened. And I understood with more compassion than I expected to feel that she had needed to believe it. That my brother had needed it too. The desire to believe in someone else's legacy is a very human thing, especially when you have spent years being the person who doesn't quite feel like they have one. Craig Lester had understood that. He had known exactly what to build and for whom. My mother called me 4 days after the arrest. Her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it, stripped of the proprietary confidence she normally carried when she talked about things going according to her plan. She said, "I should have thought more carefully before I went along with what your brother wanted." That is my mother's version of an apology, filtered through decades of not being able to say the clean, direct thing. I have learned over 31 years to receive it in the spirit in which it's offered. I went over the following Saturday with coffee and a box of the specific shortbread cookies she pretends she doesn't have strong opinions about. We sat in her kitchen for 3 hours and talked about things we had not talked about in a long time. The divorce, what those 11 months had actually been like on my end, the $47,000, which I had not told her about before because I had been too ashamed, and which she received with a silence that was not judgment but something closer to grief. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you would have said I should have been more careful, and I already knew that." She didn't argue with it. She refilled both our cups, and we sat with it for a while, which is the closest we usually get to sitting with hard things together. Priscilla and my brother are still together. That surprised me more than I expected when I heard it, and then it didn't surprise me at all. She is, it turns out, exactly as decent as she seemed the 3 times I met her, possibly more so, given what she was carrying without knowing it. She spent several months working with a therapist who specializes in high-control relationships and long-term psychological manipulation, which is a category of therapeutic practice I hadn't known existed, and which apparently addresses precisely the kind of systematic conditioning that Craig Lester had spent years performing on the person he had been raising as a cover identity. She has no idea who her biological father actually is, or what her real name might have been before he built the one she grew up with. Probably she never will. These are the kinds of losses that don't have clean endings. I have had coffee with her twice. The first time she thanked me formally, in the way of someone who has prepared the words in advance and knows they are not quite adequate for what they are trying to carry. The second time she didn't mention it at all, and we talked about her job and a documentary we had both watched without knowing the other had seen it. I liked the second time better. Craig Lester, whatever name is printed on whatever document is actually his, was arraigned in federal court in Boston on 11 counts, including wire fraud, identity fraud, and money laundering across multiple states. There are 11 of us who filed victim impact statements. I don't know when the trial will be scheduled. These things take a long time. I received a partial recovery from the seized assets, not $47,000, enough to matter. My brother and I had the real conversation about 6 weeks after everything, at a bar near his apartment. The kind of place with low lighting and decent draft beer, and enough background noise that you don't have to manage your face quite so carefully. He said he had known the text was wrong when he sent it. He said he had told himself it was the necessary thing and repeated it often enough that it began to feel true, which is how he described it. The way things do when you need them to be. I asked him what he thought the right thing had actually been. He looked at his beer for a while. Then he said, "Probably to just ask you to come." I told him probably so. We sat with that for a few minutes, without trying to move it anywhere more comfortable. That's something we're both still learning. How to let a thing sit without immediately plastering something easier over the top of it. The thing about families is that they are not collections of people who have decided to treat each other well. They are collections of people who share a history, which is different and more complicated, and a lot less flattering when you look at it with the lights fully on. My brother did something that hurt me. My mother went along with it. I spent 48 hours holding a piece of information that would have justified walking away entirely, justified sitting back and watching the whole architecture collapse without raising a hand, the way more than one person told me afterward I should have done, and I didn't. Not because the wound from that text had healed. It hadn't healed. But because there was a person in that house who didn't know her entire life had been built on something false, and she needed someone who could see clearly, and I happened to be the one who could. You can be hurt and still act. You can be the person they tried to erase and still be the person the situation actually needed. That isn't grace, and it isn't forgiveness. Not exactly. It's something more stubborn than either of those things. It's deciding that someone else's small idea of who you are does not get to be the final word. The text from my brother said I was the kind of problem that needed to be kept out of the room. The voice in a 42-second video said otherwise. And I pressed play.